Hello, Shemai, and welcome to my wild Welsh garden. It's the lull between two storms, I think, and it's pretty horrible weather out there. Now, this is the sort of downtime really between Christmas and New Year. And normally in the olden days, I would have been in the garden, sort of tidying up and getting ready for spring. Although I do have to admit, on a day like today, I probably wouldn't have been. But because I'm not doing that anymore, I do find myself at a bit of a loose end. And I think it's very easy to feel very low in the middle of winter. Well, we hear it's said a lot how beneficial gardening is for our physical health, but also our mental health and our mental well-being. And I just thought maybe I would share with you how this garden has helped me, because there was a time in my life not so very long ago when if I hadn't had the garden, I really don't know how I would have coped. It was the garden that got me up in the morning. It was the garden that got me through the day. And it was the garden that meant I could go to bed and sort of not exactly look forward to tomorrow, but certainly sort of lying in bed, planning what I was going to do with the garden was so enormously helpful. And it's all tied up with how I ended up at the top of the Swansea Valley, wilding my garden here. Because for those of you in the UK, it won't have escaped your notice that I'm not Welsh. I have a go at speaking the language very badly, but I'm not from here. I'm from England. I'm actually from Liverpool originally, but I lived in Wigan for 30 years. And for about 15 years of that 30 years, we didn't have a garden at all. We only had a little backyard. And then we moved into a house with a very small garden. It was 5 metres by 10 metres. But even though it was so tiny, we absolutely filled it with flowers. We had all sorts of things growing up the walls and filling the beds, and even a little greenhouse with tomatoes. But we always had an allotment, and we had an allotment for 30 years, and we grew all sorts of things. We grew all the sorts of vegetables and fruit. Yeah, we had all the things that you would normally find on an allotment. We had potatoes and onions and strawberries and rhubarb and runner beans, and we had a few apple trees, and we had a polytunnel. We grew all sorts of stuff in our polytunnel. We had a greenhouse, so we had tomatoes and cucumbers. We always grew flowers amongst the vegetables, and we had a wildlife pond and a wildflower area. We'd always gardened with wildlife in mind. We'd always been organic. We'd never used any chemicals. And we had a wildlife pond long before it was fashionable to have wildlife ponds. In fact, we were told we had a bit of a set to with the Allotment Society Committee, because they told us that we had to get rid of it, that it was dangerous and that somebody might drown in it, which is why it's got the trellis over it in case a very small drunk person happened to fall over and drown. But we thought this was very unfair, so we actually approached the National Allotments Association and asked what their recommendation was, and they recommended that we have wildlife ponds on allotments. So we were able to go back to the committee and show them this letter, and they had to let us keep it. But we did have to pay £10 a year extra towards the insurance, just in case there was an accident. And it was only like a metre by half a metre. It was tiny. But there you go. And actually, when we left, they gave us this little silver tray. It says, "To Roger and Isabel, 30 years a gardener. Sorry to see you leaving. Wishing you every success wherever you lay your spade. New Springs Horticultural Society." So that kind of gives you a clue that when I first came here, there were two of us, Roger and I, because Roger had been retired for a few years, and then I was retiring, and we realised that we didn't have to stay in Wigan anymore. And the only settled child that we had was actually living in Swansea. Our other children were all over the place. So we decided that we would move nearer to my son. And we also thought, wouldn't it be nice to have an allotment outside our back door, because our allotment was 3 miles away. And we used to walk, we used to cycle, we used to go in the car. We thought, wouldn't it be nice just to go out of your back door and have all your vegetables there? So we put our house up for sale. We sold our house. We house hunted and we found this cottage, and it was just ideal. I have the same amount of ground here as I had in my allotment and house gardens put together. We had a tiny little front garden as well. So it just seemed ideal for us in our old age, moving towards our dotage. We could live in this little cottage and just potter around this garden and grow our vegetables, just as we had done on our allotment. So there'd been an old couple living in this house, Brenda and Dewi. Brenda had died in her 80s, and Dewi had continued until he was about 92, I think, 93. But obviously, for the last at least 10 years, nothing much had been done. And when they put the cottage up for sale, they got somebody in with a strimmer and just trimmed everything down. So it was just a green wasteland, really, with a few shrubs and a dilapidated old greenhouse and a very dilapidated set of sheds. But it was just exactly what we wanted. And so we bought it and we moved in, and we moved in the beginning of February 2018. And then this is the sad bit, because 3 weeks after we arrived, Roger got ill and died 4 weeks later. So 7 weeks after we moved, I was on my own. So I had 3 of the most stressful life events happen within 6 months. I had retired, I'd moved house, and I'd lost my husband. And I really was reeling. I just did not know how on earth I was going to live without him. And I remember going to the local post office just to tell her when the funeral was, in case anybody wanted to go. And she said to me, "Oh dear," she said, "now what are you going to do?" I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick with the plan, and I'm going to make a garden. And that's what I did. I gardened through grief. I just gardened all day, every day. I didn't sleep well. I don't normally anyway, but I certainly didn't in those months after he died. And I got up as soon as it was light. So I'd be out in the garden at 4:30, and I just gardened all day. And then I came in when it got dark, and I went to bed. And the next day I got up and started again. And I did that all summer. To begin with, I did have some help. My youngest daughter and her then partner, now husband, had been travelling in Nepal when her dad died. They came back and they stayed on for a couple of weeks before continuing with their travelling, and they helped out doing some digging over the flower beds, digging some of the shrubs out. And then some nice things started to happen. The shrubs started flowering and the spring flowers started appearing, and that sort of lifted my spirits. But the trouble with grief is that you can't win, because if you feel awful, you feel awful, and then if you start to feel okay, or you feel a little bit better, you then feel guilty. So you end up feeling awful either way. Now, there is one good thing about being on your own and gardening on your own, and it is only one. But that is that you can make your own decisions, and there's nobody just going to disagree with you or argue with you. There's nobody that's going to say, "Oh, I wouldn't do it that way," or "Oh, I don't think that's going to work." And then when you do something and it maybe doesn't turn out just as he wanted it to. There's nobody saying, oh, well, I did tell you, or, well, I never did think it was a very good idea. We used to have a mug with head gardener written on it, and the rule was that if you were holding the mug and you said that what you wanted to do, that you wanted to do something different, like dig something up or put something in or prune something differently, as long as you were holding the mug, then the other person couldn't disagree with you. So yeah, so I can make my own decisions and have my own successes and my own mistakes, and there's just me to say well done, or well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all. I decided I would start with the vegetable patches because I wanted to get them ready for the growing season, because I wanted to grow vegetables. There were two big vegetable patches, and that you could not tell the difference between the veg patch and the path around. It was just a sea of green. But I dug one over and dug out a barrow loads of dandelion roots. And the other one I made into a kind of raised bed. I put scaffolding boards round and lots of cardboard, and then filled it with topsoil and compost. And then I planted those up and grew vegetables during the summer. And on the side, what I call the side garden, which is where the polytunnel is now, and which is going to be the grassy areas, I put vegetable patches there as well and planted those up. So that first summer, I certainly had plenty of vegetables. And then one day I was looking out of the window and I decided that I needed to sort of break up the area to the left of the garden in front of the greenhouse, because it was just one long green lawn. And so I decided to put a trellis up halfway up the garden, but I didn't know how to do it. And so I got a man in to put the trellis up. And then I made the flower beds in front of the trellis, because I discovered at this point that the paths were very slippy when it was wet. They were all made of stone and really quite treacherous. So I took all the stones up and used them to edge the flower beds and sort of made little tiers, really. And then I put wood chip down on all the paths. And I also asked my man to renovate the dilapidated old shed and make it look pretty. So by the end of the summer, the garden was looking really quite neat and tidy. And looking back at these photographs after 5 years, I suppose what strikes me is how incredibly neat and tidy it all looked, and remarkably weed free. And yes, how things have changed. A few other things happened that winter as well. I cleared all along the back wall and planted a native hedge, and I dug a pond and I planted up that flower bed. Now, I had always wanted a summer house, and I noticed that there was one part of the garden that got the very last rays of the evening sunshine, and I thought that would be just an ideal place to have a summer house. And so I found a local company that would make one to fit and ordered it. And at the beginning of 2019, in January, I got my summer house. So at the end of my first year, what can I say? I was absolutely exhausted, but I did feel like I'd kind of made a garden. But two things came to me that summer. One was that I was growing far more vegetables than I could possibly eat. That, there's only me now, and there's not a big family to feed anymore. The other thing was that I really did miss my polytunnel. So I decided that I would get rid of the veg patches on the side garden, and I would have a polytunnel there, because it just seemed like it was exactly the right size. And this is where it's very useful to have a son who's 6'3". So my son came up and he helped me to put the polytunnel up, and it's been there ever since, and I use it to grow vegetables and flowers and all sorts of things. So that's kind of it, really. All the main elements of the garden were in place, and things have moved on from there. Things have changed. Obviously, I've put more trees in. Some things have failed, some things have done well, some things did rather better than I needed, and I had to take them out. I've planted more fruit trees, I've planted more fruit bushes. I've moved away from growing annual vegetables to growing perennial vegetables, just because it's less work as I get older. And of course, I've moved towards becoming a wild gardener and wilding my garden and gardening more for wildlife. And like I said earlier, with grief, you can't win. I love this garden. I absolutely love being out here, and that makes me happy. But then I think, but Roger would have loved it too, and that makes me sad. But that's the nature of grief, I'm afraid. He's not here, but the garden is full of memories. There's the tall aster that he rescued from the dump, from the compost heap on our old allotments, which is so fabulous for pollinators at the end of the summer. There's a number of shrubs that he took cuttings of that have grown in this garden. There's the winter honeysuckle, there's the verbena, the forsythia, and the forget-me-nots that just fill the place in the spring are the descendants from a packet of seeds that he sowed, many years ago, probably 30 years ago. And the garden will continue to grow and develop. And that's why it's called gardening and never gardened, because a garden is never finished. So I'll continue with my journey, wilding my garden, and I do think that Roger would approve. So if you've got to this point in the video, thank you for watching. I hope you'll come again. If you're new to the channel and you would like to accompany me further on this wilding journey, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video. And I'll see you next time. Bye. Hwyl fawr.